So the name I feel like can be really misleading to people. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It sounds a lot like just focus and hyperactivity.
Right.
And what's really confusing about that name is there are a lot of people that don't even present with typical hyperactivity. So that presentation is called ADHD inattentive type. And that presentation usually is more issues with focus. It is emotional regulation is with every presentation type of ADHD. Emotional regulation is a huge barrier for ADHDers. We also struggle with executive functions. So your executive functions are things like prioritizing, working memory, self-regulation. So that can show up in a lot of ways and impact your life in a lot of areas that go beyond just being able to pay attention at school or at work.
I'm Rees. This is the Sofia Unfiltered Podcast, where we bring together thought leaders, wellness entrepreneurs, makers, and emerging health leaders. We're here to have raw, unfiltered conversations because sharing your stories has the power to change lives, help others heal, and transform the way we take care of ourselves. Here we go. Welcome back to Sofia Unfiltered. I'm Rees, and today we're talking about ADHD. ADHD is one of the most common childhood disorders and can continue through adolescence and into childhood. Listen in as we sit down with ADHD coach Meredith Carder as she discusses her own personal story and shares strategies that we can all benefit from. Meredith, thank you so much for being here. We're excited to have you. With the spike in numbers of diagnoses of ADHD, we can't wait to hear all of the things. But first, can you start us off and tell us what drew you into specializing in ADHD coaching?
Yeah, I'd love to tell you a little bit about my path here. I have 3 children. My middle child was diagnosed with ADHD many years ago now. And throughout that process, I really started seeing a lot of the signs of ADHD in myself. So I realized shortly after her diagnosis that I also had ADHD. And at that time, I was reading everything I could about the subject. I was consuming so much information and just realizing that ADHD was about so much more than just struggling to focus and hyperactivity and things like that. And realized how little those around me understood ADHD. So I decided that I wanted to dive even deeper into learning about it. And I began working with an ADHD coach. I did a lot of corporate training and development for my career leading up to that. So I was coaching people already for my career. And when I realized that I could coach people in a way that could make a really huge impact on understanding their brain and creating effective strategies for their life, it felt like a no-brainer. So I took an ADHD coaching program, started talking about ADHD on Instagram, and quickly found a lot of people that wanted to hear what I had to say about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that definitely makes sense. For our listeners, can you tell us, right? I mean, the standard textbook definition of ADHD is, right, the focus and the hyperactivity. So can you tell our listeners what ADHD is? I mean, what did you have come to incorporate into ADHD?
Yeah, so the name I feel like can be really misleading to people. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It sounds a lot like just focus and hyperactivity.
Right.
And what's really confusing about that name is there are a lot of people that don't even present with typical hyperactivity. So that presentation is called ADHD inattentive type. And that presentation usually is more issues with focus. It is emotional regulation is with every presentation type of ADHD. Emotional regulation is a huge barrier for ADHDers. We also struggle with executive functions. So your executive functions are things like prioritizing, working memory, self-regulation. So that can show up in a lot of ways and impact your life in a lot of areas that go beyond just being able to pay attention at school or at work.
Yeah. And so you mentioned you were diagnosed later, and we know there's a lot of people searching for these solutions for their children, but you actually didn't realize you had this yourself until you started understanding about your kids. And I'm sure there's a lot of listeners out there who may be struggling with this. Or what was that realization, that moment that made you reach out to your own? I guess you went to your primary care physician. Can you walk us through a little bit about how you dealt with this? So if any of our listeners out there are like, hey, I think I have these signs, but I'm not sure. I mean, sometimes we all get that point, right? The summer itch, or is it, I can't focus? Like, what would make you want to reach out and walk us through your story, please?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, there were just like light bulbs going off like crazy when I went through the diagnostic process with my daughter. You do a lot of questionnaires and things like that. And throughout the conversations I had with her providers, I was realizing that the struggles I've had my whole life that I thought were just like character flaws, like that felt to me like I should be able to overcome and had been trying to overcome in so many ways, really were all tied to this neurobiological condition that I also had. So my approach after I realized I had ADHD, first I was really overwhelmed because the process was very hard to navigate for my daughter and getting school supports in place. So I took some time to learn and really reflect on the examples of how ADHD had presented throughout my entire life. And I did a lot of assessments online. There are some free assessments you can take that are really helpful. They're not a diagnosis, but you can list the symptoms you're having, you rate symptoms, and that can tell you if you have enough of the constellation of symptoms for it to be ADHD, because as you said, we're all overwhelmed. We all struggle with focus from time to time, especially if we're parents and we're working and we have so much on our plate.
And you haven't slept, you
yes,
might be eating it.
And
so it's very hard, right? It's what I'm asking. It's very hard.
Yeah, it is very hard. And there's also a lot of conditions that either are comorbid with ADHD or that have similar symptoms, anxiety and depression. A lot of women, especially, are treated for anxiety and depression their whole life. And then they realize finally that it's ADHD. And then when they treat that, they finally start feeling a difference.
That is unbelievable.
Oh, yes, it is.
The latest stats say that, about 50% of teens, I think these were girls, going into college a few years ago, were going in with a diagnosed anxiety, some type of disorder. And if you think about that, how many of those could be ADHD? How many of those could be the wrong medicine that we're just taking and giving our teens?
Exactly. Yeah, it's really frustrating because, well, yes, a lot of times they exist together. It's very hard because sometimes the anxiety is a result of trying to operate with a brain that's not designed for the systems you have in your life. So there's anxiety around realizing that you are more hyper than your friends and you interrupt a lot and you are, getting a lot of negative information as a child. So you mask that ADHD really well and you don't appear to have those issues. But all of that masking of symptoms and overcorrecting can cause a huge amount of anxiety. So it is a very common story. I work with a lot of clients that were told they have things like treatment-resistant depression, treatment-resistant anxiety, which are real things, but did not get results until they started really
actually treating for the right thing.
Yes, exactly. So it is so important, I think, that we urge our medical community to dig deeper with these diagnoses.
Yeah, and I also think that it's just really important to advocate for yourself, and at the end of the day, you have to say, like, this isn't working, I need something else, whether it's reaching out to other providers, coaches, something's just not right. When you know something's not right, we just really want you to advocate for yourself, not just, okay, well, I guess this is what it is.
It's not so hard. Self-advocacy.
Yeah.
Self-advocacy, I think, is critical if you were seeking an ADHD diagnosis because especially as an adult, there is still a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of providers that haven't caught up with the current research. There's a lot of stigma.
They're only humans. They're only humans
exactly.
too, right? So
yes. So it can be very hard. I do think that as you build that self-advocacy skill, it gets easier to find the providers that can truly help you. We talked a little bit about what's that process if you are having these questions and you're wondering if you just need more sleep or if these symptoms are truly ADHD, I always say start with one of those self-assessments, because then it can tell you if it is flagging other things potentially. And that gives you just like a little bit of something to take into your provider. A lot of people start with a general practitioner and ask for a referral. Some general practitioners are confident that they can diagnose, but most do not. Most want you to see a psychiatrist for an evaluation. So asking for that referral is important. If you have the type of insurance or you are able to self-refer to a psychiatrist, that's a really good first step, because that process will be more in depth and really get into diving into the symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
If you do make that type of appointment, I highly suggest coming in with examples of how symptoms have impacted you throughout your entire life, because ADHD doesn't develop as an adult. So if you have ADHD as an adult, you had it as a child, whether you were diagnosed or not. But providers will want to see evidence that it existed in childhood. So thinking about not necessarily school performance, but like what was school actually like for you? Did you get good grades, but never had good study skills? Did you get overwhelmed by things that seemed to be easy for other people? And what were those things? So thinking about how this could have looked for you throughout your lifespan and writing those examples down and taking them to a skilled provider would be the best way to start, in my opinion.
Yeah, that sounds great. And then for your kids that were diagnosed, I know you mentioned before we started the show today that you mentioned this could be a little bit hereditary. So is this something that, and I have kids too. So is this something where you should be looking for specific behaviors? What do we do for our kids? Is it the same? Like we don't really know, especially when they're younger, what's going on at school. What do we just wait for teachers? Like, what are we looking for? Weekends, evenings?
Yeah. So ADHD is one of those things that, yes, it's more obvious at times if your child's having difficulties in school. But most kids are also going to have those difficulties at home too. ADHD, definitely there's the focus issues. Oftentimes, if you have that child where you are trying to engage with them in homework or any type of activity, and you can see they're kind of daydreaming a lot. Like we're the daydreamers. We're those people that seem to be off in space a lot of times. The hyperactivity piece can look a lot of different ways. A lot of kids may not be hyperactive in the classroom, obviously, to their teacher. Those ones get identified, right? The kid that can't like stay in their chair and that, is always blurting out. But hyperactivity can also be a kid that really has a high need to fidget a lot, that task switches all the time. That's a version of hyperactivity. So if your kid is like jumping from thing to thing all of the time, you can notice hyperactivity in speech. So as a girl, I was called Meredith Motormouth, and I talked really fast, and I talked a lot, and I jumped from topic to topic all of the time. So that's a symptom that is a little less obvious than some of those symptoms that cause trouble for other people. Struggle with emotional regulation is a huge one. Obviously, kids are still developing those skills, but not being able to regulate, having a very short fuse. Oftentimes, parents, if their kid is really good at masking their symptoms at school, they will come home and it'll be like they explode when they come home. And these parents are so confused because they're like, the teachers are saying they're great, they're fine. That's how my two kids that have ADHD present. Like they are perfect in the classroom. And then they get home and it is like just, an inability to regulate, just completely struggling with really everything at that point, controlling emotions, getting anything done. So if you noticed giant temperament swings based on environment, that can be a sign too that there is something else going on.
What is the age that it's mostly diagnosed? Right? Are we talking about like 1? Are we talking 4?
Usually the earliest that it is diagnosed is around 3 or 4. And that's typically in the most severe cases where the child's impulsivity is so high that it's a danger to themselves or others. Most kids are not going to be like treated with medication at that age unless they are very extreme. Usually, I think the average age right now with the latest data is for boys at 7, and for girls, it is 12. And then it's very complicated because then we have all these adult diagnoses as well. So for adult women, it is about 35 at this point. Yeah.
What do you think is driving the age of 35 for adult women?
There's a lot of things happening, right? So there is that hereditary component we touched on earlier. ADHD has an 80% hereditary component. And so if you have a child with ADHD, you likely have a parent with ADHD or a grandparent or someone that is closely related to you. It is possible to have two neurotypical parents, but it's not as common as we think. And so a lot, you take your kid, you learn these statistics, and you're looking at your spouse and you're saying, is it you or is it me? And then you start kind of going on this path to discovery, right? And usually I think that answer comes pretty quickly once you truly understand how ADHD can look differently in kids and adults. As far as other diagnoses for people that do not have children, there is a lot more information out there now. There is information on social media that we didn't have access to before. So people will see a reel or a TikTok and start digging deeper. People with ADHD have an interest-based nervous system. So if you see something on ADHD, you're like, oh, wait a minute, it sounds like me. I can guarantee you're going to go down that rabbit hole and you're going to consume a lot of information. And there's also just the issue for women in general that we were excluded from research until the mid-90s. Did they start studying ADHD in girls? So our current diagnostic criteria is still for boys. So even a girl today may not be recognized with that diagnostic criteria, leaning more towards those obvious hyperactive symptoms. And then, you're in midlife, you have a child, or you are working a lot, and you might have coped okay with the systems you've built for yourself throughout your life. But then as the life pressures compound, people are really starting to struggle with keeping things together, and they start seeking help and finding those answers.
Well, I mean, that is actually really great that we're able to find these answers now and the information is out there. A little bit scary. We can have misinformation on social media, but it's really awesome that the information is there on the internet. We can get what we need and hopefully, again, self-advocate. So are there strategies or treatments, and is that different for children and adults? What do you do? Like, you found out you have ADHD. Is this medicine? Is this medicine for your kids? What are the
Yes,
treatment
it can
options?
be. Medication is available for both children and adults. Some people find it life-changing. Medication can really help your brain get the dopamine it needs to be able to task initiate. It can help calm down hyperactivity. So that is a good first step if your symptoms are overwhelming to the point that they're impacting your daily life for both kids and adults. But I always say to my clients that it can never just be pills. It has to be pills and skills. Even if you are taking medication and it's working great, you still need to understand your brain. You need that psychoeducation of how ADHD is really impacting you and to dig deeper into that. And once you have that understanding, then you can start crafting strategies to help you with the symptoms that are most impactful for you.
And is that different across the board, or are there what is it doing to the brain? You mentioned dopamine. Do they need more than the regular?
Yeah. So one of the biggest theories around ADHD is that people with ADHD's dopamine receptors work differently. So they actually process dopamine really, really quickly, which means we have a lower availability in our brain. And if you're not familiar with what dopamine does for us, dopamine is a chemical that regulates a lot of things in our body, but it also is a chemical that regulates or helps us with motivation. So dopamine is released when we're anticipating rewards and things like that. So a person with ADHD, like a neurotypical person, might feel that little bit of a reward just by checking something off their to-do list and doing the thing that's required of them and they're supposed to do. A person with ADHD doesn't get dopamine from that, or if they do, it's processed very quickly and it doesn't last. So that means that we struggle with lower motivation. We struggle with lower energy to do things. We struggle with focus without that proper dopamine in our system. So medication acts on those systems to allow for more of that in our system. So I think of it as it gives us some of the raw materials we don't have. But what we do with those raw materials is important, right? Because oftentimes you can have more motivation. But if your motivation is all towards something you're like not really needing to do at the time. Like if that motivation is towards not the right task for your goals, that's not really going to help you, right? So learning new skills is important to be able to use those raw materials to benefit you.
Now, are there other strategies? Because we see a lot online. There's like eating for ADHD and stuff like that. So what does your diet, how does that impact ADHD? And is there something to this?
Yeah, there's definitely something to this for sure. And I want to make a note too that like medications are not appropriate for everyone. Sometimes there's existing conditions. So that's where I think these strategies around diet can really be important. I don't think it's the be all end all. I don't think you're not gonna cure your ADHD really with anything, right? It's with you for your life.
So it's more like, how do you optimize your life around this condition?
Exactly. So when it comes to diet, I mean, I think any brain-based condition will benefit from a diet that is balanced, that has enough protein. Protein is especially important for people with ADHD because protein is where you get those amino acids that are the building blocks of dopamine. So it helps you produce more dopamine if you are eating enough protein. So that's one that I think about a lot in my life and my two kiddos that have ADHD, making sure they have protein in the morning to help them be able to have some of those raw materials. A lot of people with ADHD really struggle to have consistent eating habits. Oftentimes, a lot of us have struggles with feeling hunger cues. So we don't really feel that hunger cue until it's too late, which means a lot of people are skipping early meals. And we also struggle with, when we say we struggle with focus, it's not just that we don't have focus, we can hyper focus on things. So oftentimes I see this with adults where they're not in a school schedule or a schedule that forces them to eat at a certain time. They'll hyper focus on work, until 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and then they don't have any calories in their body. And we need fuel to be able to get things done. So you create a cycle. Yes, right? So we all know how we feel when we don't have enough food in our body. It's harder to focus. It's harder to do a lot of things. So it basically takes those ADHD symptoms and like ramps them up when we don't have enough fuel. So oftentimes it's not as much although that does help, but it's eating enough, eating regularly, making sure we're not, a lot of times people with ADHD, I don't want anyone to feel shame about these habits that can come with it, but sugar, like anticipating sugar and a sweet treat, like that's a way to get dopamine in our brain. So we might be kind of attempting to treat our ADHD by consuming a lot of sugary stuff, like having treats every day at a certain time to try to kind of get enough dopamine in our brain to get going. So if we don't know the root of all of this, it's really hard to change those behaviors. A lot of people struggle with like binge eating and things like that with ADHD, and they don't have any success treating that until they truly understand what's driving that and what's happening in their brain to create those behaviors.
I mean, you bring this up about, the dopamine. Are there tests that you can do specifically, like draw blood? Can we find out what our levels are? Right? Isn't this?
Sadly, there's not. They haven't been able to test for dopamine levels in the brain. I think that would give us all so much relief, right? I think that parents really wish there was that so they could know, okay, yeah, this is real. This is what's really happening. But the science is not there in the way for us to be able to truly be able to see that at this point.
Yeah, that's really just too bad. It just seems like it would be really great to just go in, take the test, and then know what's going on. But I think we all have the sugar craving. So I think, for somebody who doesn't have it, I think I can really relate and understand. I don't really, really understand. I'm obviously not in your shoes, but everybody understands that high you get when you have sugar, right? Like that's pretty standard across the board. So it's the super focusing. So having not just a clean, balanced diet, increasing the proteins, but making sure it's regular so they're getting what they need, the over-focused driving. Wow.
Yeah, it's like creating behaviors. Like one I suggest all the time for people that tend to hyper-focus on work and forget to eat, and then they're like a mess in the evening and eating their whole pantry. I tend to say to keep nutrient dense snacks literally right next to your computer, not in a drawer. You need to be able to see it because
you need to remember.
Your brain just needs to have it right in front of you. When you're hyper focused and you have ADHD, it is so painful to break that hyper focus. So you may actually know you need to eat. You might have that thought come into your head, but you do not want to interrupt that kind of focus. It feels so good to be able to be working on things. So if you know you have to like walk into your kitchen, make something to eat, you're going to convince yourself to just keep working on the thing. But if you have something that's nutrient dense available to you, maybe that's not the perfect meal, but it's something that's going to give you enough fuel to tide you over to a point where you're going to feel better about breaking that focus and having more nutrition.
Are there other strategies? I mean, and this seems like a lot of lifestyle, right? You mentioned, they could be impatient, emotional regulation. So is this something, I mean, I know sleep and food, the nutrients are huge. Are there other kinds of strategies that you recommend? I mean, there's also sensory overload. Is that a real thing?
It is a real thing. It is not under the diagnostic criteria for ADHD at this time, but research shows that most people with ADHD are struggling with sensory processing. I know I have a huge issue with overstimulation. So managing that, I think, is really important because that's a function of regulation as well, right? If we are in sensory overload, we're going to have all of our symptoms be impacting us even at a higher rate. Right. So setting up your environment in a way that's sensory friendly for you.
Maybe limiting social media, the computer or TV, like that can be being in public a lot. That could be draining.
Yeah. I mean, like knowing what your sensory bank is like, I think can be really helpful. And that's like, if you have a job where you tend to be overstimulated during the day because there's a lot going on, what can you do in that environment to help? Like maybe you need headphones on that cancel noise. Maybe you need to take frequent breaks to go out in nature or things like that. But then also, how are you spending your budget? If you're in environments that are, going to be max stimulation for a while, like maybe your evening activity should be something that's less overwhelming sensory wise. Maybe that's like going to karaoke, every Friday night after a very long day in the office. Maybe that's not helping you. So thinking about those, and that's where I think that psychoeducation piece is so important, is understanding what that is and then crafting these routines and patterns that account for your ADHD in your life.
Meredith, this has been so insightful. We appreciate you coming on to discuss this. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners about things that you wish you had known about ADHD a little bit sooner? What do you wish all parents, or maybe these women should know?
Yeah, I think that if you suspect you have ADHD, get on that list for a diagnosis. Even if you live in an area where there's a longer waiting list, that diagnosis can be key to understanding yourself in a way that will have a huge impact on your life. And if you're a parent and you have ADHD, understanding yourself will help you parent that child with ADHD. I highly encourage anyone that has a child or thinks they have ADHD to do a lot of learning around it beyond just the conversations you will have with your providers, because those conversations are going to be very limited. They're going to be focused on treatment. But living a good life with ADHD is all about learning how to accommodate yourself. It, in the right environment, can have a lot of wonderful assets and strengths. But if we're so impaired by the other issues, we can't really lean into those strengths. So learn about it for your kid, learn about that for yourself, and then don't be afraid to change how you approach certain things in your life, because it really can get a lot better.
Yeah, and it just sounds like eating healthy, sleeping regularly, building in some kind of fixed structure, thinking about my own son and just building in that quiet time if needed, it just sounds very structured and clean. So it doesn't sound like a terrible, lifestyle change, and to develop these habits early on is only going to benefit you in the long run anyway.
Absolutely. I feel like it's not the be all and end all, but it is so important. The irony is that a lot of our symptoms of ADHD make it hard for us to create those symptoms. Those systems. So we might have to think about routines a little differently than we did before, and we might have to approach it a little bit differently to account for our struggles. But they definitely make a huge difference. I've been running for a really long time. I discovered that habit in adulthood, and I was just like, wow, I have a different brain on the days that I get up in the morning and I exercise, and I carry that through adulthood. And I think that it definitely didn't fix everything that was going on for me, but it did make a huge difference. in how my life felt living with undiagnosed ADHD. So those things do matter. All of those healthy habits that help everyone are critical for ADHD, but you may have to rethink the advice around them and understand sort of how your brain is interacting with the idea of a routine and what that really means for you to be able to be successful with it.
Can you give us an example for those listening who may have kids, they're trying to understand, but can you give us an example of what you mean, like trying to implement this routine and potentially the difficulty doing so?
Well, routines are not one size fits all. So I think if we were going to give a kid a super prescriptive routine, they're probably going to fight against that a little bit. So thinking about a routine that actually is appealing, the first step of a routine being something that has some kind of positive feeling or reward for the child is really, really helpful. Oftentimes parents are like, you can't do anything fun until you've done all of these other things. But when we do something that gives us a little bit of reward at first, that releases dopamine, which in turn helps us with motivation. Oh. So giving your kid a little bit of a win first thing in the morning can really help. Giving them some visual steps to their routine. A lot of people with ADHD really struggle with working memory, and that's your ability. It's kind of like short-term memory, but it's really like applying memory. So it's that ability to take a piece of information and apply it to the next step. Mm-hmm. So you might think your kid hates routine, but really you think it's an easy routine, but that kid can't remember the steps of that routine on their own. So like a visual chart or something like that to remind them of their steps. Even if it feels like they shouldn't need that and it's too simple, it can really help a child with ADHD to have something right in front of them to reference every day. And then giving them some choices in the matter as well, I think helps a lot. These kids are being asked to do a lot of things that are so low reward in their brain every single day. So giving them some agency on how this routine is going to look and still get accomplished what needs to be accomplished, I think can really help.
Those sound like incredible ideas for those kids who may have this. That's awesome. Meredith, thank you so much. And before you go, we have a question that we ask all of our guests. If you could, please share 3 fundamental pillars that contribute to your well-being.
Okay, so my first one is that I try to bookend my days with interest. And so the reason I do this is because the ADHD brain is very curious. Like we are very interest driven. And if we ignore that piece of our brain, we're going to feel really flat and apathetic and have a hard time doing anything else.
And it probably doesn't help with motivation either.
No, it's very hard because like that impacts all of those brain chemicals and we need those brain, like we can think about doing something, but if we are just not in a good place and we have nothing to look forward to, we have no feeling of reward coming, then we're not going to be able to initiate much of anything in terms of tasks. So I start every day. Most days, I would say 99% of my days, I start, that first hour belongs to me. It means I have to get up earlier than the rest of my family, but I've been doing it for so long that I'm very clear on the reward of doing that. And I have some coffee and I usually do movement. So that's my interest piece in the morning is some type of movement for me because I find that really rewarding. And then I try to block at least an hour in the evening to do something that is learning based for me. So that could be reading some interesting articles. It could be just reading a novel, but something that's like whatever is kind of like grabbing my interest at the time. I give myself that time each day. And that just like really helps me feel more invigorated and able to take things on with a positive attitude. Prioritizing sleep. I know we talked about that a little bit. It's so hard for us with ADHD, and there's some biological reasons that also contribute to that, but it is such a huge impact for me. So I do a lot of things to help with my sleep. I do a transition routine when I'm done working every day to kind of close out my work day. So even if my brain tells me it wants to like hyper focus on a project or I'm like feeling really creative, I try to transition out of that because I know if I don't do it by a certain time in the evening, my brain's going to be spinning with all the ideas in my head and I will not sleep. So that's really important too. And I also really like to prioritize giving my mind a little bit of time to wander every day. So I think that our world is so structured for us all of the time. And even when we have downtime, we're like on our phone or we're like doing something. But I find that when I don't give myself a little bit of time to just like let my brain brainstorm and do its thing, it's going to do it when I'm driving my car, or it's going to do it when I'm in a work meeting. You know what I mean? So I find for me, it's harder for me to sit and do that. I like to like walk and do that when possible. That seems to open things up for me a little bit better, but that walk is not going to be with a podcast. It's not going to be with music. It is going to be specifically so my bright brain can just process and think and explore different ideas. And when I do that, everything feels a little bit easier in my day. And I find myself struggling less with the distraction during meetings and driving and all of those times.
I know you mentioned, you're doing this transition on your step 2, like from work into your evening, that's to help the ADHD brain. But honestly, I think that can help everybody. I mean, who doesn't, what entrepreneur doesn't keep those ideas and keep you up all night long? I think these are incredible, Meredith. I think it's, the work you're doing is really amazing to help other people.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Where can our listeners connect with you and find out more information or book into your monthly program?
So the place I hang out the most is on Instagram. My handle is hummingbird_ADHD. So I create almost daily content there. You can also reach out to me in the DMs there as well. And I have a book coming out in just a couple of weeks here, August 27th. It's called It All Makes Sense Now, Embrace Your ADHD Brain to Live a Creative and Colorful Life. And you can find that book wherever your books are sold. And that would be a great way to get some of that baseline understanding of ADHD. And I expand on some of the strategies in the book as well that I talked about here today.
Well, thank you so much for being here and taking the time to write the book, right? Especially as somebody who has ADHD, you're taking care of your kids, and you still manage to help other people. Not only that, but focus enough to write a book. I think that is just a true testament to how much you have the capacity to help other people. So thank you so much. Thanks so much for listening. This has been Sofia Unfiltered, a podcast by Sofia Health, the #1 marketplace for health and wellness. Find services, classes, and products from the top health and wellness providers. Book an appointment or join live classes now. I'm your host, Riley Rees. If this episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear about it in the comments section of your favorite podcast provider or with a 5-star rating. Let us know what your biggest takeaway from this episode was, or share it with someone you hope to inspire. Join us again next time for more real conversations, stories, and insights that help empower you with the knowledge and inspiration needed to transform how we care for ourselves.